There is actually a deeper threat than terrorism, and in many ways a broader and more insidious one, which is the Islamist ideology that fuels not only the terrorist threat that we faced, but also this broader challenge to our society and our culture. The question, Islam or Islamism? There are many, many moderate Muslims, but the fact that we have moderate Muslims doesn't necessarily mean that Islam is a moderate doctrine. And we have people like the president of Turkey who actually get themselves pretty whipped up by terms like moderate Islam. He famously has said, you know, Islam is Islam and that is that. Where do you come out on that?
One of the suppositions in your question is that, well, most Muslims are moderate, but yet, you know, the faith may not be. So how did these Muslims turn out that way? Was it by accident, or how was it over time that they came to, like my family, want to come to countries like this to be free and escape some of the oppression that they lived in? And I think, you know, people like Turkey's president and others, the Imam, clearly we have a crisis in leadership. Clearly we have a doctrinal crisis also, in that much of what is put forth by leaders within our community that are theologians, many of the things that you'll hear us talk about today and that Robert and others talk about are truly beliefs and theology that is put forth as Islamic law by many imams and scholars, or ulama as we call them, that the community defers to. But yet there's a schizophrenia to it, in that many in our community, I mean, I know my parents and others, I have yet to meet Muslim parents that would be proud of their kids to go to become an imam or to become a theologian. And you look at history, there's no doubt that there was 600-700 years of Islamic history in which there was a moderation of thought. If I was alive at the 13th century, in many Jewish texts, it's considered the golden age of Judaism at that time. Maimonides did his great work, etc. Ultimately, we as Muslims need to go back and figure out how to create new schools of thought, to create new theology, so that we don't abandon what it is to be Muslims. Because when I teach my kids about Islam, if I see, you know, if we start getting into the narrative that Islam is immoderate, what am I going to be teaching my children? How am I going to allow them to identify in that relationship with God if the message is that Islam is immoderate? I'm not in denial, like most Muslim Brotherhood groups, that bin Laden is not practicing Islam, or like the president of Turkey is. Clearly that is a version of Islam that we need to counter. But we can't give them the mantle of Islam. We need to have that civil war within the faith to allow moderation, to allow ideas of liberalism to get into the faith, so that we can see a new version, a moderate version, a westernized secular liberalism get into the ideology of Islam to make that happen and consistent with Western society.
Dr. Jasser says that the Muslim parents don't want their children to become imams, and there's a reason for that, because Islam does teach a violence and radicalism at the core that is embedded in the Quran, embedded in the teachings of Muhammad, that many Muslims obviously don't want to partake of in their lives, because human nature being everywhere the same, people are people, they want to have a job and raise their family and live a life, and they don't want to be bothered with strapping on a suicide vest and killing people and so on. And so they keep a distance from Islam as it is officially codified, and they live lives in accord with generally more Western values. But the question is, what exactly is it that Islam does say? And that is something that is readily verifiable from the sources of Islam. The question of what is Islam cannot be defined by Spencer or by Jasser or by Osama bin Laden. The question of what Islam is defined by what Islamic groups throughout history have used to define it, and that is the Quran and the teachings of the Muhammad, the teachings of the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence, which have been fixed since the 9th century. And there is no sect or school of jurisprudence in Islam that is recognized as orthodox that does not teach that the community of the Muslims worldwide has the responsibility to wage war against unbelievers and to subjugate them as inferiors, depriving them of essential rights under the rule of Islamic law. That is a universal that is taught among all the sects and schools. And that there have certainly been periods in which the Islamic world did not wage war against unbelievers with the fury that we're seeing now, but that was not because of a change in the teachings of the various sects and schools or any rejection of Muhammad's imperative, which he said, I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and I am his messenger, or the Quranic imperative to subjugate the people of the book and make them pay the jizya, the tax, specified for non-Muslims in chapter 9 verse 29. These things are indeed taught and always have been. But there have been periods in history when, for various reasons, for humane reasons or for reasons simply of military or societal weakness, these things were not pursued. However, we also have to be careful not to overstate that case. Muslim Spain was not really a paradise of proto-multiculturalism. Maimonides, whom Dr. Jasser mentioned, actually complained bitterly about the oppression that the Muslims had placed the Jews under, and he escaped when he could. The reality of the situation was very hard for the Jews and Christians in Muslim Spain. They never had equality of rights with the Muslims, and when a Jew was actually placed in a position of authority, which is in contravention of Islamic law, which mandates that the Jews and Christians have a subjugated status and never hold authority over Muslims. When in the year 1066 in Granada in Spain, a Jew was placed in authority by a Muslim ruler who had a more humane outlook, the Muslims in the city rioted, and 4,000 Jews were killed in a pogrom because they understood that what he had done was in contravention of the laws of Islam. The problem here that is before us is indeed embedded within Islam itself. Osama bin Laden and the others today make their appeal to peaceful Muslims on the basis of Islamic authenticity. They claim for themselves the mantle of the true teachings of Islam. Now, I'm not saying, and never have said actually, in any of my books or articles or anything, that they do represent the true Islam. But it is undeniable that they claim to, and that they make converts to their point of view on that basis, by appealing to the Quran and appealing to Muhammad. And so the question of what is Islam and what is the way to reform has to tackle that head on, and to offer an alternative vision of the Quran and Muhammad that actually realistically confronts their construction of these materials and explains why it is that it must be rejected, instead of simply wishing it away or pretending that it were otherwise.
You know, listening to Robert, it reminds me of when I was chief resident at the Naval Hospital, these physicians that came, some of them had great board scores and they aced the tests, but yet they couldn't treat a patient because they couldn't tell when a patient was sick or ill. And you know, you have some of the data right, but I think that you've not, you know, you're not a Muslim, you've not necessarily been impacted by Muslims that love their faith or are spiritual or understand their scripture in a way that is non-threatening, and you've basically been taking a lot of the doctrine and ideologies out of certain theologians and allowing that to become what is Islam. And as historians and as human beings and as human anthropologists, if you will, when you study a religion, you need to study its people and study how it acts the way it is. And I would ask each and every one of you, whatever faith you believe, Judaism, Christianity, whatever your faith is, at the end of the day, when you decide your own relationship with God, how often do you personally defer to your imam or your priest or your rabbi? If you don't defer to the leaders of your community and you make your own mind up, are you then an uninformed, ignorant Jew or Christian, as we're hearing Robert say that Muslims that really don't do that, they just sort of adopted Western values and don't really understand their faith. They're basically ignorant nominal Muslims who seem to somehow be deluded into some spiritual path that they're calling Islam, but is really not Islam. Even though when I do my prayers, I'm citing scripture, I've asked I try to understand what the meaning is, I've questioned my parents. I basically used the faith that I believed, that I grew up learning. It wasn't politicized. When I went to the University of Wisconsin, I finally started to learn about the MSA and the Brotherhood groups.
When I tried the blind sheikh, we had a lengthy defense case, and a number of authentically moderate Muslim people came in to testify. And every now and then, during the course of the testimony, a question of Islamic doctrine would come up. What does jihad mean? What is zakat? And at least 3 times, these authentic, moderate people, when asked a question like that, would say, I wouldn't be competent to answer that. You'd have to ask, and they would turn to the homicidal maniac who was in the corner of my courtroom. And I don't want to, I want people to understand the task of reform that you're up against. I mean, we've heard for several weeks now that there's an Arab Spring of democratic uprisings in the Middle East. We got a real snapshot a couple of weeks ago, the referendum in Egypt, where, you know, to be honest, the secular progressive Democrats that we've heard about for 6 weeks got wiped out by a margin of about 77 to 23. What is that? Taking everything you're arguing as true, how mainstream is the Islam that you're talking about?
Dr. Jasser was saying that, well, you know, I'm not a Muslim, and so I must not really know anything about this. That's a needless mystification that actually kind of prescinds from any discussion we could really have about this at all. Anybody can read the Quran, anybody can read the Hadith, and anybody can know can observe what's happening in the Islamic world. And what happens in the Islamic world is that genuine reformers like Mahmoud Mohammed Taha in Sudan in 1985, who posited that the Meccan verses of the Quran, which are generally more tolerant and peaceful than the Medinan verses, which mandate warfare against unbelievers and their subjugation, should take precedence. Whereas in mainstream Islamic theology, as settled long before the gate of ijtihad was closed, the Medinan verses take precedence, and the violence is something that's mandated for all time. Taha was executed for heresy by the Sudanese government, and so the point is that this kind of thing is not an easy discussion to have. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be happening or that we should not encourage genuine reform, but we have to do it open-eyed and realistically with a genuine assessment of what the prospects really are and what the situation really is.
But you just said yourself, anybody can read the Quran, anyone can read the scriptures.
Yeah.
But doesn't that mean that there is an ability for people in a critical fashion to read the doctrine and interpret it for themselves?
Oh, without any doubt. The question is, will Islam undergo, why can't Islam undergo the same evolution as Christianity did and as the West did in the Enlightenment? Well, obviously, theoretically it can, but we have to grapple also with the fact that the sources teach different things. And the Judeo-Christian tradition of the dignity of the human person and the equal dignity of all people before God simply does not have parallel in Islam, which teaches, for example, in the Quran, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but harsh or ruthless to the unbelievers. This dichotomy between the believer and unbeliever characterizes all Islamic tradition and makes it very hard to establish a society in which all people are treated with equal dignity. And that's still not the case today, as we can see with the massive persecution of Christians by Muslims who claim Islamic authenticity around the Islamic world.
We have to have a way to separate out who the real moderates are from the false moderates who have been allowed to sort of exist under the radar screen because we've been so hyper-focused on terrorism that we're missing a big element of what we call political Islam. We need to move our barometer from terrorism to Sharia because it's a more clear dividing line between those who want to impose the more comprehensive political system and economic system and military system and so on. That there are Muslims who take Sharia, however they take it, to be a personal guide to how they live their lives, but don't want to impose its comprehensive system on the rest of society. And that those are the real moderates. And then there are others who say they may not want to blow up a building to get this done, but they actually do want to see the United States Constitution supplanted by their view of Sharia. The reason I think that's an effective test is you can lay out some basic elements of Western liberalism. The idea that people have a right to make law for themselves, equality, freedom of conscience, privacy, so on.
Where Nidal Hassan was growing up in a house in which his parents told him everything was a Zionist conspiracy, everything was against the West, this government's against you, it's against Muslims, Islam is the solution for everything. All of these supremacist type concept groups like, that are part of the Brotherhood legacy groups in America, they use the victimization mantra because A, it collectivizes Muslims, and B, is part of the narrative to say that Islam is the enemy of America, and they feed into that. So if we're going to counter that, we have to break it not only from its beginning, but from its core ideologically, which is through, I believe, the separation of mosque and state. If we can teach Muslims that ultimately Sharia has no place in government, ultimately that government should be based in reason, not based in what they call Sharia. I saw at the Islamic Society of North America, Siraj Wahhaj stand up in 1995 and say he wanted to replace the US Constitution, which was a man-made document, with this document from God, which is the Quran. I stood up then in front of everyone and told them that that was sedition and that I would never participate in anything related to ISNA again. Izbegovich has a book about Islam called Islam Between East and West, in which he says he was never more Muslim than when he was in solitary confinement. So as I talk to youth, I say, if that's true, then you don't need government for your faith. You don't need any rights for your faith. And you need to be able to separate mosque and state and base law based in reason.
Separation of mosque and state. Prospects?
Oh, well, I'm all for it. I'm actually the associate director of a group called Stop Islamization of America, which is dedicated to separation of mosque and state. That is, to resisting the encroachments of Sharia in the United States, the stealth jihad, the nonviolent attempts to bring Sharia here. But there's no denying that these people who are trying to bring Sharia here believe that it is God's law and that one is deviated from Islam by resisting Sharia and resisting the spread of Sharia however it's done. Even Izbegovich, that Dr. Jasser just invoked in regard to speaking about the separation of mosque and state, the guy who said that he was felt most Muslim in solitary confinement, well, I wish he'd stayed there, because he actually wrote the Islamic Declaration for the Balkans and did his best to establish an Islamic state. He didn't believe in separation of mosque and state at all. His Islamic Declaration is a manifesto for establishing an Islamic state, first in the Balkans where he was, but also around the world, all the way through to Indonesia. The people who do these things, and the people who killed Taha and threw Bashir out the window, who I mentioned before, and Dr. Jasser said that, well, they didn't, I'm assuming that the assassins truly understood Islam. I'm not actually assuming that at all. The assassins were assuming that. They were claiming to truly understand Islam, to be representing Islam when they did what they did. But see, the problem in some is this. We do need solutions, and we do need to have an honest and open discussion about what solutions are viable and what are not. But our quest for solutions so far, after 9/11, has led the United States government to take many, many Muslim individuals and groups as moderates who are not moderates. Siraj Wahhaj, whom Dr. Jasser mentioned as wanting to replace the US Constitution with Sharia and a caliphate, he's actually also the first Muslim to give an invocation before the US Congress, because he was deemed a moderate. And everybody was in such a rush to find solutions that they were insufficiently critical and insufficiently attentive to what exactly makes a moderate. Is a moderate just somebody who's not blowing something up right now? Or is a moderate somebody who is actually confronting the sources of Islamic radicalization that the radicals themselves explain are in the Quran and the Sunnah? We have to confront that. And I am all for modernization, for reform, for a real opening of Islamic thought. But that cannot be done without assessing what it is that's causing the problem in the first place. And that's really all I'm contending.
Robert, can I ask Robert a question? What is your solution if the Prophet's demonized, if Islam is demonized as a faith? How do you get a solution out of that?
Well, what is demonization? Is it demonization if I quote Muhammad and I quote him when he says, be sure to collect the jizya because that's the source of your livelihood?
You're not answering my question.
Well, actually, I am answering your question. The question is how can we proceed if we're demonizing Muhammad? I don't think it's demonizing Muhammad to quote his violent and supremacist statements about subjugating the Jews and making war against the Jews and Christians and so on. And so if he said those things, if he's believed to have said those things, then then obviously there has to be formulated some new understanding of him as the excellent example of conduct, as the supreme guide for behavior. But instead of pretending that he didn't say these things and was actually somebody who taught peace and tolerance like Karen Armstrong's fictional Gandhi-like Muhammad. The real Muhammad from the Quran and the Hadith, he did say these things. And so I reject in the first place the premise of the question. It's not demonizing him to say that he's doing these things, but how are we going to deal with that if he did?
I think all these things need to be addressed that Robert appropriately brings out, but a lot of what he gets are from hadith, discussion of the Prophet. I believe in many Muslims, much more so I think than Robert would care to admit, think that those are garbage. The Prophet never said such a thing. Those pieces of history
are considered authentic.
Okay, that's exactly it. The people that consider authentic are tribal war leaders that came out of Pakistan, came out of Afghanistan. I can show you derivations. Okay, so this is the issue, is that there's been a control of the intellectual domain of Islam that has been centralized in Al-Azhar University in Saudi Arabia and propagated by petrodollars, and we need to create alternative narratives to start to marginalize the radicalism. You have to build the foundations of liberty, because 99% of who I was as a Muslim I knew before I could have had any of the discussions I have now. It was part of what was right and wrong, my superego. All of this was part of my faith long before I knew who Ibn Taymiyyah was and Ibn Kathir and all these people that Robert has become an expert in. But yet when you look at most Muslims, I think ultimately we need to give them alternatives so that they will no longer be sucked into brotherhood legacy groups that want to collectivize Muslims. This is the other thing that I think that's really important. Domestic policy is exactly the same issue as foreign policy. So when we try to compartmentalize things and say, well, Egypt, we need this policy, in Yemen, we need this one, in Syria. Domestically, it's different. It's one issue. Muslim reform, separating mosque and state, building institutions that if we build them here, we can then take these ideas, translate Road to Serfdom to Arabic and get it into schools in the Middle East, and translate Jefferson's papers on religious freedom into Arabic and get them into Muslim communities.
It's all happening so quickly, but it's all happening in one direction. We heard over the last few months how wonderful it was that Egypt and Tunisia were throwing off these dictators and establishing genuine Western pluralistic secular democracy, and almost immediately, and I was warning all through that actually the Salafist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia groups were the ones that were going to take over, and I was on show after show on Fox and they said, oh no, 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 you're fear-mongering. Juan Williams said to me, none of this is going to happen. And here it's all happening so quickly. Immediately the Egyptians vote in, as Andy pointed out, 77% of Egyptians voted for constitutional changes that would marginalize the Christians even further and keep them out of the government and pave the way for the Brotherhood to take over. So what happened to our wonderful secular pluralistic democratic revolution? The problem that we have in the Islamic world is not from Western non-Muslims demonizing Muhammad. I certainly hope there can be reform in Islam. I certainly hope there can be an opening in liberalism and Hayek's Road to Serfdom in Arabic and so on, but actually the Arabic language is noted for having the fewest translations from Western languages into Arabic every year. And there is a great closed nature to these societies, and this is going hand in hand with this Islamic resurgence. So I would love to see it all happen, but just to say that it should happen and that it ought to happen is not saying it's going to happen, and we have to assess the problem realistically.